Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. So hey, I'm Thomas Jockin. Thank you for coming this week to talk about fonts and their attributes. So today we're going to talk about a little variation, or I like to think, not even variation, but a concept in typeface design that I think it's worth discussing. So a common question or statement made by a lot of people who may know about typefaces is, why make new fonts? Are there enough? Well, I mean, the typical response is, well, why make enough? Why make more songs? There's plenty of songs in the world. Why you gotta make new songs? But besides that kind of surface level response, I think a more deeper level is which that answer responds to a little bit is, well, there's a lot of variations, and even if things may be similar, the deviations or possible variations of decisions a designer can make in making a typeface can have very large implications in the overall effect and attributes of a typeface. So we're going to go over this week with a project I think really clarifies that point. So let's get started. So we got these two typefaces here, Mislab and Jubilat. Now, there's actually a lot of variants going on, but I want to focus on particular the uppercase H. If you were to play these in isolation, I really wouldn't hold it against you if you thought these were the same typeface or very closely similar. They are very similar. They're both classified as slab serifs, and again, in isolation, it'd be reasonable to, if it looked at it quickly, to assume that they're pretty much the same letter. There's variations inside them, but as a general observation, it looks pretty similar. But so the uppercase might have this similarity in them, but in all this variance in the lowercase is really where they change so much in their voice and attributes. So moving forward with the lowercase a, we can see a very dramatic shift in how the lowercase letters were treated in these two different typefaces. In Mislab, we have a generally open aperture. There's no terminals whatsoever. There is a generally flat bowl. There's a calligraphic treatment, almost of a black letter textura style. It's very modular. It's a very regimented, rigid kind of construction of how the letter was made. Speaking to that style of black letter calligraphy, that gives it this modular kind of little rigidness and harshness about the structures in a lot of ways. Let's contrast that to Jubilat, where we have a bowl terminal. There's some more obvious ones of the bowl terminal and how the bowl of the A is being handled. It's kind of a teardrop shape in its counter. It's angled. It's generally more closing in on itself. So generally we can say the Mislab is more of kind of a interpretation of like a humanist or calligraphic source, more pulling from there, just done in a lower contrast slab serif genre, while Jubilat is more a traditional Clarendon style slab serif with some of these motions. Moving on to the S, we can see this again, also in proportions. The Mislab S is much more narrower. It's following a much more kind of humanist proportion, and the lack of terminals in it. Compared to Jubilat, we have a much more wider proportion, and also what's interesting, even within this typeface, it's not a dogmatic use of the same kind of terminal like in the A. So instead of a bold terminal, we have kind of these more slabby, straight stroke serifs. Not even serifs, terminals really in this S. So even within this drama of a slab serif, there's variance in the typeface designer's decisions of how they want the components to work together. Onto the G, we can see a very big difference in their strategies. The Mislab G is much more, again, of this humanist attitude calligraphic source. The way the proportions are drawn in this G follow almost what we look at like a Garamond kind of G, would it be proportionally drawn, but in its general proportion compared to especially Jubilat. It's much wider, especially in that loop section. It's a widening triangle, basically. The widest part's on the bottom and it tapers to the top, while Mislab does it more, it's more I guess more rectangular, if I had to put it in any way, to proportionally how it's drawn. But again, the comments before I made about the A in Mislab being kind of really jaunty, very modular, there's a kind of rigidness about it You can see this really in the G. How the neck connects to the spine, then to the loop. This is very modular and it's very blocked and rigid in how it and rapid how it moves from one to the other. This is very much following a kind of textura black letter calligraphic tradition. Think construction of how a letter would be made. And overall, that changes the whole tone of the typeface. We'll close with the E, looking at that. Again, this reinforcement of this point of the Mislab E is much more of a humanist, much open aperture. It's very reasonable proportions, while Jubilat's much more enclosing space kind of proportion. So what can we say based on these assessments of its attributes? Well, we can definitely say that while their uppercase letters might have some similarities between them, a lot of their other design decisions have tell that they're meant to be used in different purposes and are having different voices. Jubilat also just generally is a space much tighter, plus it's kind of closed aperture treatments. It seems this is more built for like a headlining application. It's best used in kind of a subhead header environment. Well, Mislab probably sits best in the subhead and text settings based on its proportions and construction of its letter forms. And also just a general tone of everything. In Mislab, everything's kind of more smoother. There's a general kind of polish and glidiness in how everything is drawn. It has a certain kind of just, again, it's kind of a warming, smoothing kind of tone to it. Mislab is much more kind of almost, you could actually technological. It almost has this kind of like squarish rigidness calling from this kind of textura calligraphic tradition of how the strokes are being made together. So while it might be a lower contrast, low contrast kind of slabby serif letter typeface, it's actually it has a much more techno rigid kind of precision, like not full robot, but certainly much more serious and certain more like technology rigid, engineered in its voice than Jubilat does, which is interesting considering its historical sourcing. It's much later in the past, but in our current interpretation of it, how we feel looking at it, it feels way more constructed, rigid, and engineered. So from an editorial voice perspective, maybe you want something more engineered or something technology based, you would use Mislab. If you something a little more like a deli or not even ye old time, but more kind of a downtown shop kind of attitude, or like the really good local sandwich shop, you would do something like Jubilat. It would feel very earthy and homey and very friendly and warm in its attitude and how it's constructed. So these are the assessments of looking at these two different typefaces. And again, I want to walk away from noticing that while the uppercase letters may be kind of more tied in and actually very similar to each other, there are wild variations in the lowercase changes the whole tone and application of these typefaces. That's the big lesson you can take away from this week on Fontribute. This is Thomas Jockin. I hope you learned a lot from this conversation. If you think about a project, if I had to ask you what kind of project we would use these typefaces on, feel free to share these in the comments. Love to interact with you guys online. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation. And this is Thomas Jockin. Have a great week. Take care. Bye.